welcome back. Time for bed. Now, when you think of ancient medicine, you probably imagine bloodied pus-covered bandages and Roman gladiators getting mercury in them. But while those are all real things that happened, there was actually one extremely common medical practice in the ancient world that we still can't get over. Let's start at the beginning. You wake up, there's something moving in your hair. Honestly, you're too groggy to care. Your head is pounding like a blacksmith's hammer. Your throat feels like you gargled gravel, and when you try to sit a pose, surprise your joints feel like they've been cursed by a vengeful forest, which your door creaks open and in walks the town's most trusted healer. The barber. Yes, that barber. The guy who gives questionable haircuts on Tuesdays and pulls teeth on Thursdays. Today's Wednesday, so lucky you it's bloodletting day. He squints at your face, scratches his beard, and mutters something about imbalanced humors. He then whips out a rusty knife and a bowl. No idea what he's doing. But hey, he read half a scroll once, and that's good enough, right? See, back in the day, people believed your body was ruled by 4 mysterious fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it meant one of these was having a temper tantrum. So what did they do? They'd bleed you, or force-feed you boiled leeches and hope for the best. Medicine was less cure the illness and more terrify the illness into leaving. Whole theory of illnesses being caused by rogue fluids goes back thousands of years and popped up in a bunch of different places, including Greece, Rome, China, and India. It even had its own fancy name: humorism. The idea was that everyone had 4 types of temperament based on which of these 4 fluids was most dominant. And it wasn't just your personality that was determined by these mysterious substances, but also your health. Imbalance any of them and you were asking for trouble. Too much blood made you hot-headed and, well, feverish. Too much phlegm turned you cold, clammy, and prone to respiratory problems. And too much black or yellow bile messed with everything else, creating a melancholic, irascible person susceptible to all kinds of ills. Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, didn't we just invent these ideas? No. We mean like 2,000 years ago, ancient Greeks, like Hippocrates and Galen, spent centuries refining and promoting this theory. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, helped turn humorism from a pseudoscientific idea into a full-on pseudoscientific system. And once you have an influential figurehead, suddenly everyone wants to be a humorist. Medical practitioners across the ancient world took their lead from Hippocrates and Galen, despite not always understanding their logic. Like take the barber/soot. He likely doesn't know why bloodletting is only supposed to be done on Wednesdays, but he read somewhere that it's important and he's pretty sure Wednesdays are unlucky, so better safe than sorry. So how exactly did bloodletting work? Well, depending on which humor was out of whack, healers might prescribe different treatments. To get rid of excess blood, they would cut open veins, suck the blood out with a pump, or use leeches to slurp it up. Treatments for yellow bile included forcing you to drink a powder made of burnt mouse bones. Just burn some of your hair and breathe it in. Really, anything went. But let's go back to the blood. As far as bodily fluids go, it seems like the liquid of choice for ancient healers to manipulate, and for good reason. Blood was seen as the seat of the soul. In fact, some cultures even believed it housed the memories you'd eventually upload to your new Facebook page upon death. Plus, the heart, the organ responsible for pumping it around your body, was placed right in the center of your chest, making it literally the middle of everything. Since blood was so darn central, it was also considered the main character in the battle between good and evil that raged within us. And boy, did it need to stay on good terms with the other fluids. After all, it was the blood that colored our skin. Make it too cold or too hot, and your face would become a canvas of social embarrassment. Too much blood and you'd be flushed. Too little and you'd be ash. One of the most telling signs of illness was a change in complexion. Yellow meant your body was struggling to produce enough blood. Remember, emotions were tied to fluids, too. So, a jaundiced complexion implied depression and anger, while paleness indicated fear. Doctors used terms like plethoric to describe someone who was too red in the face, and anemic for someone who was too pale. And they weren't talking about blood pressure or anemia, per se. They were saying this person's whole outlook on life is wrong. They've got the wrong amount of blood in their body. What did they do about it? Well, there were 2 options. Add more blood or take some away. To raise your blood count, they'd give you a transfusion, usually with animal blood, because why not? But this was obviously quite risky, especially since they weren't exactly careful about where they got their product. You might walk out of the clinic with a new shade of complexion, but also a couple dozen new mosquito friends. So as an alternative, they tried taking blood out. Doctors believed that doing this would cool you down both literally and figuratively. And how did they do it? With blood. This is a blanket term for removing blood from a patient, whether through practices like leeching, scarification, lancing, cupping, or in the US, the last one is still used today, but under much safer circumstances, typically to lower the amount of blood a patient has in their body before surgery. Otherwise, it's just a weird hobby you picked up during COVID in the ancient world. However, the reasoning behind bloodletting was slightly off. Practitioners would choose to drain you on certain days of the week, because they believed blood flowed differently at different times. The hottest hours of the day were apparently from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., so that's when you should get your blood sucked. Some doctors even claimed to be able to tell your future by the color of your blood. Was it get ready for riches beyond your wildest dreams? Then there were others who thought bloodletting should be performed on days corresponding with the phases of the moon. Because why not? Take that, Copernicus. But the real question is, does it work? In cases of extreme anemia, removing blood could make patients feel a little better. But other times, like if they had a raging fever or dehydration, bloodletting could make things much worse. In general, though, there is zero evidence that treating symptoms this way cures diseases. In fact, considering how unsanitary it all was, it probably made some illnesses worse. Still, it stuck around for millennia. Part of that was thanks to its perceived simplicity. Bloodletting was easy to understand and implement, even if its actual effectiveness was about as reliable as a drunk monkey with a banana in a piñata. But another reason was a bit more sinister. Practitioners had a vested interest in keeping you sick. We mean, what makes you think I put these slides together myself? No. One thing about long-lasting pseudoscientific systems, though, is that they end up changing as time goes on. Even though bloodletting remained popular throughout the medieval period, people slowly stopped believing the four humors controlled your personality. Instead, they began to believe that each humor determined your personality. Yeah, we don't get it either. Despite all that, the idea that certain conditions required bloodletting stuck around until the mid-1800s. People selling magic beans on Instagram promising they'll make your hair grow long and luscious. But some of the weirdest health scams are hiding in plain sight, masquerading as treatments that actually do work. Like CBD oil, which is mostly just marketed to a bunch of people who really want it to help their chronic pain. Or intermittent fasting, which might have some benefits, but is also being sold as a miracle cure-all by the wellness set. So we decided to turn back the clock and look at what some of the most common scams throughout history really were. It's me, and this is fake medicine. Now, let's say you didn't want the barber's blade. Maybe you wandered into the apothecary's shop instead. It smells like burnt rosemary, vinegar, and something faintly cool. Shelves are crammed with jars of dried frogs, powdered mummy, and mysterious substances with charming names like oil of earthworms and unicorn horn. Spoiler, it was usually narwhal tusk, or straight-up chalk, and the most expensive medicine, tincture of gold, because if it sparkled, it had to be healthy, right? You ask the apothecary about a recommendation, and he tells you that you need a special potion, a unique blend of exotic ingredients that will cost you an arm and a leg. Okay, maybe not that one specifically, but definitely another one. He can't possibly tell you the exact recipe because it's a secret. But rest assured, each bottle is lovingly handcrafted with ethically sourced toad oil and pulverized Peruvian bark. Just pay the delivery boy when he brings your order next week and everything will be alright. Just like today, most of the medicines sold in these shops were a mishmash of plants, minerals, and sometimes animal parts. None of them were very well understood chemically or biologically, but many did contain compounds that could treat various ailments. Sometimes the remedies were even effective, but only by chance, and since no one really knew what was in them, they couldn't know why. There was no scientific method or evidence-based practice. If you were sick, you went to the apothecary because that's where you bought your soap and your perfume and your lottery tickets. Modern medicine might be more sophisticated, but this model is still around. Today, people often go to markets to buy unregulated herbal remedies because they want a quick fix and they trust mom-and-pop shops more than Western doctors. They might have heard good things about a particular store from friends or seen positive online reviews, but those reviews may have been written by paid actors. The problem is that when you buy fake medicine, you may end up with a placebo pill that does nothing, or a product that is dangerous and interacts badly with the real medicine you're supposed to be taking. But let's say you were lucky and the medicine actually worked. That doesn't mean it's safe. Now, back in the day, the FDA did not exist. That meant there was a constant stream of new patent medicines flooding the market, all claiming to be the best treatment for everything. And they weren't wrong. Most contained alcohol, which kills germs and can alleviate pain. But that wasn't the only active ingredient in these so-called cures. They often included opium, which is highly addictive, cocaine, which is extremely dangerous to take without medical supervision, and other drugs that could have serious side effects. Not to mention that if you think paying $80 for a bottle of pills is outrageous now, just wait until you hear how much these things cost. In today's money, it would have cost over $2,000 to treat syphilis with salvarsan, an arsenic-based drug. Now, before you start feeling too smug about how you'd never fall for something like that today, remember that we've had the FDA since 1906, and for decades, they allowed manufacturers to make extraordinary claims as long as the products actually had some medicinal benefit whatsoever. So while you probably won't find any bottles of snake oil being sold in your local pharmacy, you might be surprised to learn that manufacturers are still allowed to advertise that their products improve digestion, even if that claim has no basis in science. This is called a structured function claim, and it's one of the few types of advertising claims that don't require any proof. You can slap a bottle of goat snot with the words "supports healthy digestion" and sell it on Amazon. As for actual safety testing, the FDA requires drug manufacturers to prove that their products are safe before they hit the market. But what counts as proof? And what happens when a company tries to pull the wool over the FDA? That's what we'll talk about after this message from our sponsor. Back in 1962, a drug called thalidomide was supposed to be a wonder drug for pregnant women suffering from morning sickness. Doctors in Europe prescribed it enthusiastically, and soon thousands of babies were born with shockingly high rates of missing limbs and other severe deformities. The United States had banned thalidomide years earlier after the FDA required the manufacturer to provide proof that it was safe. While that tragedy led to reforms that strengthened the FDA's authority, the agency is still underfunded and constantly plays a game of pharmaceutical whack-a-mole with drug companies trying to sneak unsafe products onto the market. To stay ahead of these scammers, the FDA needs to be able to anticipate problems before they arise. That's where you come in. Now let's get back to the show. When it comes to safety testing, it isn't enough to simply demonstrate that a product doesn't kill people. The FDA wants to know if it works, which means testing for effectiveness. And that sounds pretty straightforward, but it's surprisingly complex. What counts as working? How long do you test a product for? And how many people do you need to recruit for the study? And then there's a question of bias. In 2022, the New England Journal of Medicine published results from 76 different studies on popular complementary and alternative medicines. After evaluating each of them for quality, the researchers concluded that only 11% met minimum standards for evidence-based practice. Many of the studies were biased because they failed to recruit a large enough sample size or account for outside factors that might affect the results. Others were just flat-out fraudulent. In 2019, 6 people were arrested for scamming millions of dollars out of investors by faking clinical trials for a made-up Alzheimer's treatment. The ringleader told his victims that their money would go toward treating 400 patients, but instead, he spent it on cars, houses, and fake lab equipment. Maybe that tincture of gold I mentioned earlier actually does reduce the symptoms of dementia. It's impossible to say because no one has ever tested it. The trouble is that when you make a buck selling fake medicine, the consequences are real. It's hard to imagine a world where people would willingly poison themselves. But the truth is, many of the most popular health scams throughout history started out with good intentions. They were based on traditional practices or natural ingredients that seemed to do some good. But if you don't have solid data to back up a treatment, you're just guessing. And if someone gets hurt because they trusted your guess, well, that's not cool. So before you drop a couple $1,000s on some untested treatment plan, ask yourself, am I just trying to cure an illness, or am I trying to cure my wallet? I know what you're thinking. Have you tried elderberry syrup? Did you ever look at a leech and think, man, if only that had wheels? Well, the future is here with this week's very special episode on medieval medical marvels. I'll stop singing now. Starting off our tour of terrible treatments is the cure for all that ails. Yama. This toxic metal was prescribed for everything from the common cold to the plague. Doctors believed it purged the body of bad humors, whatever those were. And what better way to ingest this wonderful poison than through a plaster applied directly to the skin? So sit back and relax with a nice paste made of either dried flowers or animal fat, mixed with lots of pure mercury. This stuff worked wonders, unless you consider blindness, hair loss, or gangrenous lesions, all of which happened on a regular basis. For example, there was an Italian doctor named Peruta of Perugia who used mercury plasters extensively. There was just one problem. In fact, his patients became known as the Shining Ones due to the permanent shine they gained by slathering themselves with it. Shiny, shiny. But let's leave mercury behind and move on to something much more pleasant. From the Middle Ages to the mid-19th century, doctors believed that illness came from an imbalance of the four humors. To bring those humors back into balance, you had to get rid of blood. And how do you get rid of blood? You cut something. So whether it was a vein artery, or just your plain old skin, time to make a slice. And if you thought the barber was going to save you with a straight razor, this was serious business. We're talking lancets, syringes, and even specially designed scarificators, which would have multiple blades to make many cuts at once. These tools would be reused, sometimes for hundreds of patients, just for a little extra flair. If you wanted to bleed like a king, they also offered velvet bags filled with small pebbles that could be tied off an artery. It was the perfect combination of luxury and pain. But bloodletting didn't have to be messy or painful. Just visit the apothecary. For an enema, they de-insert a long tube into your rectum and wash things out with a whole litany of unpleasant liquids. And the most popular choice, of course, blood. We're not exactly sure why doctors went so heavy on the blood. It wasn't as if there was a shortage. After all, they were making quite a lot of it disappear. In addition to the usual bloodletting methods, they decided to go one step farther. Enter the cupping treatment, where they place cups over various parts of the body, usually the chest or back, and heat them up. As the cups heated, the air inside expanded, creating a vacuum that sucked the skin upward. Doctors believed it drew out the bad humors from deep within. However, it probably served the dual purpose of sucking the living crap out of your epidermis. The results, however, were truly spectacular. Bruises and blisters. Nothing says I love my health like skin that looks like someone beat you with a purple Sharpie. And if you needed to hide the evidence, we've got you covered. There was a treatment for that, too. Doctors would apply a salve to bruises, cuts, and any other marks to hide them. Sounds convenient. Just one problem though. That salve contained over 80% pure lead. Yep, the same stuff that killed Andrea Key. After painting himself with lead whites to cover his extensive syphilis sores, he went blind and died horribly. But hey, at least he looked great. And if these treatments sound weird, wait until we get to surgery. When you walk into the operating room, you're going to see a sight that'll make you laugh, cry, or puke. Candlelight. There's usually not much else. Maybe a wooden table, some sawdust, and 3 dudes ready to hold you down while the doctor saws your leg off. Oh yeah, and the barber has a sign hanging outside his shop. Literally nothing else. So how did they perform operations without anesthesia? Well, sometimes they just made you really drunk. They called it passing out drunk. Hey, they were getting the job done. It didn't matter if you were coherent. What mattered was that the operation got done. After all, there were only 2 ways to die on the operating table. There was the surgical death and the infection death, and both were equally brutal. If you survived, well, you still might die, but at least you wouldn't be in pain. If you thought medieval barbers were scary, you ain't seen nothing yet. They didn't bother sterilizing equipment. Instruments were shared. Surgeons had questionable hygiene habits, and many patients died of infection. But hey, they didn't have penicillin, so to quote Jeff Foxworthy, that hurts us poor people twice. But there was a bright side. If you were in England, the fees for these operations were based on the type of surgery, ranging from 6 shillings and 8 pence for treating burns to £3 for major operations. But in France, they took a different approach. They charged patients based on the amount of blood they lost, so you literally paid for your life. Of course, that didn't mean you actually survived, but, hey, at least you didn't pay for nothing. For a treatment that was pretty much guaranteed to kill you, try the Judas cradle. This torture device was used for confessions and punishments during the Spanish Inquisition, but it also found its way into some operating rooms. Here's how it worked. A person would be strapped onto a chair, and then lowered slowly onto a sharp stake driven into a block of wood. The sharper the spike, the more horrific the pain. Doctors used it for everything from stretching out tendons to extracting molars, but it wasn't completely useless. It is thanks to the Judas cradle that we know how much pressure it takes to snap a femur. Spoiler alert. Speaking of extraction, have you ever lost a tooth and been horrified at the mere thought of your dentist pulling it out? Well, in the Middle Ages, they not only pulled teeth, they pulled off some seriously nasty tricks. While a healthy mouth may only need a tooth removed every 150 years or so, medieval mouths were a different story. Decay was rampant, and impacted wisdom teeth were a common problem. Not having X-ray technology meant that dentists had to rely on feeling around with their fingers, and they weren't shy about yanking out teeth that didn't necessarily need to come out. But that wasn't the worst part. These so-called professionals didn't wash their hands before operations. They didn't use anesthetics, and they pulled out teeth with pliers until they broke.
Ouch!
And once the tooth was out, they didn't offer you a lollipop. They stuffed the hole with wool, lead, or even human hair. The ultimate insult, though, was reserved for the final step. Instead of brushing their hands, they would dip them in a bowl of wine, then rub the extracted tooth in it. Finally, they'd pour the wine into a cloth and apply it to your gums. Now you have a lovely bouquet of bacteria to ward off infection. But hey, at least you don't have a toothache anymore. You know, it's easy to think of the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance and superstition. It was certainly a period of tremendous hardship, disease, and horrible medical practices. But maybe it's worth remembering that if you lived back then and complained of a headache, you probably would have been prescribed whiskey instead. The year is 1348, and you are dying. You've tried treating your bubonic plague with the bleeding method, mostly because you couldn't figure out how to get to your lymph nodes without stabbing yourself. Well, that, and the fact that bloodletting was so popular back then, doctors performed it, even when they knew it wouldn't work. Now you're feeling worse and very anemic, so you decide to switch tactics. You limp away from the sore bones somehow still breathing, but your faith in medieval science is, let's say, shaky. You've bled, boiled, bathed, and been barbecued. So where do you turn now? To the village wise woman, of course. You shuffle your half-healed self into a smoky little hut just past the pig pens. Inside it's cozy, but chaotic bundles of dried herbs hang from the rafters. Bones clatter in a bowl, and something is bubbling in a pot that smells vaguely like licorice and dew. The woman squints at you, mutters a few Latinish syllables, and waves a chicken feather over your head. You're about to pay her in eggs and a half-used candle. A surprising number of these remedies actually worked well, compared to getting sawed open and doused in vinegar. That is, medieval science, also called the Galenic method, did have some hits. For instance, they correctly linked the function of the heart to the circulatory system, and they made some strides in treating dislocations and fractures. Though their treatment of choice, setting broken bones by twisting them, sounds more painful than the injury itself. What it lacked in bedside manner, however, it made up for in actual efficacy. Sometimes, and if you didn't have a bone to pick with the local sawbones, you might be able to get an appointment with a barber surgeon. Unlike surgeons, who were typically clergy, barber surgeons were usually lay people, which sounds great until you realize clergy were educated and barber surgeons were not. If you did make it to the barber shop, surgery, the good news is you wouldn't need an anesthetic. The bad news is you wouldn't get one. In fact, your friends would probably be the ones administering your pain meds. A few sips of wine or maybe some opium from the poppy seeds you ate for breakfast would have to suffice. So, let us talk about those home remedies you can use between the pig pens and the barber shop, shall we? First up, willow bark. Yes, that's basically medieval aspirin. Salicin, the active ingredient in willow bark, has similar effects to salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Unfortunately, there was a bit of a drawback. Willow bark only worked about a quarter as fast as salicylic acid. Oh, and it was also slightly toxic. Not exactly a game changer, especially since your friendly neighborhood wise woman might mistake your non-specific aches and pains for rheumatism. Just give me the Advil, lady. Speaking of pain relief, what about the old standbys, heat and cold? As far as medieval medicine was concerned, the four humors, or four essential qualities of the body, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood needed to be in balance. And everything you did to improve your health should aim for that. Sometimes heat therapy was recommended. In other words, stay warm. This could involve wearing lots of layers, drinking hot beverages, or, and this was kind of gross, taking warm animal dung and rubbing it over your aching limbs. Other times you needed to stay cool, like when you were suffering from inflammation. Then, you could apply a cold compress made of snow, ice water, or, well, you get the picture. These treatments were most effective, though, when applied to an area of the body where the pores were open, so you either had to spend a lot of time in a sauna or take a long, hot bath first. Okay, you might be asking, what about actual medicine? Things that go down your throat and into your insides. Those were usually herbal remedies, often in the form of teas, tinctures, or pills. Most medieval herb gardens included plants that are now considered a little too dangerous to harvest, things like foxglove, which can resolve cardiac arrhythmia, but only at a fatal dose. There were also less dangerous options like chamomile and lavender. Unfortunately, many herbal treatments were incorrectly applied. For example, foxglove was commonly used to treat stomach ailments, while its life-threatening side effects went unknown or ignored. Next up, let's talk about honey. Your mom told you this stuff would help your boo-boos when you were little, but it turns out medieval moms were onto something. A dab of honey on a wound prevents infection and accelerates healing. This is because honey is acidic and contains hydrogen peroxide, both of which fight off nasty bacteria. Plus, its sticky texture creates a barrier that keeps germs out. So next time you get a paper cut, skip the antiseptic wipes and slap some honey on it. Wait, no, don't do that. It's not worth the risk of it's best reserved for minor cuts and scrapes. But medieval doctors weren't exactly known for their discretion, so you might find yourself slathered in honey for every scrape, burn, and bite. Another remedy you'll find in both your grandma's pantry and your local apothecary: garlic. The Egyptians were using garlic, topically, to treat bacterial infections as early as 1700 BC, and Hippocrates himself touted its effectiveness against parasitic worms. Though garlic really fell out of favor after the fall of Rome, it made a comeback during the Middle Ages. Garlic was usually combined with vinegar and used as a pot, meaning a soothing, usually stinky paste was applied directly to the affected area. Aside from helping with cuts, burns, and bites, garlic could also reduce swelling and relieve toothache. And it helped that garlic supposedly repelled vampires, in case that was the real problem. But what about more serious ailments? How did medieval science deal with those? Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and even cancer could all be treated, according to the medical establishment, with the right amount of blood. Bloodletting was the practice of removing blood from a patient to treat various ailments. And this started way back in ancient Egypt. It was practiced by everyone from priests, to physicians, to barbers. Even they used leeches, lancets, scarification, and cupping to drain a patient's blood, usually in accordance with the four humors theory. The idea was that illnesses resulted from an imbalance in these four humors: phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. Bloodletting removed the humor that was present in excess. That's all well and good, except there was zero evidence that it actually worked. In fact, it could make things worse, especially in cases of pneumonia or tuberculosis, when the patient desperately needed their immune system to be at full power. Removing blood doesn't just decrease the body's ability to fight infection, it also risks anemia, which, was already your problem in the first place. So let's talk about astrology, because yes, your medieval diagnosis may have depended on what planet you were born under. Classic doctors actually carried zodiac charts to determine when and where to treat you. Some refused to bleed patients under certain moon phases, because nothing says scientific rigor like scheduling surgery based on a horoscope. If you were born under the wrong star sign, you might have received a totally ineffective treatment, or you might have had your ailment written off as incurable. In fact, despite some of the treatments mentioned here being surprisingly effective, medieval medicine as a whole was not, and it wasn't for lack of trying. It was routinely practiced by intelligent, well-meaning people who genuinely wanted to help others. It just happened to be wrong, unscientific, and occasionally deadly. But hey, given the alternatives, including near-anesthesia-free surgery, it's hard to say which was the lesser of two evils. Medieval medicine developed over centuries in Europe, but when it comes to modern medicine, we're just scratching the surface. There's always something new around the corner, like invisible bacteria, superbugs, gene editing. What do you think the future holds? Alright, so, you've had enough weasel feet and screaming barber surgeons for one lifetime. So someone wheels you on a cart made of questionable wood and pure optimism into a monastery infirmary. This, my friend, is where real healing happens. A gentle-faced monk greets you. He's wearing a wool robe, a wooden cross, and a faint expression of terrified serenity. He doesn't yell. He offers you a bowl of warm broth and asks about your dreams. Not just any book, a massive hand-capped leather-bound medical manuscript, filled with Latin, hand-drawn organs, and marginal doodles of demons for dramatic flair. This is the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, or maybe De Materia Medica, depending on how hip your monk is. Either way, it's your new prescription pad. Now, before you picture modern hospital wings and foredrips, medieval hospitals weren't sterile institutions. They were holy places, a cross between a soup kitchen, hospice, and confessional booth. Hospitals in this period were run by religious orders, most commonly monks or nuns, who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but also had to deal with leprosy, gangrenous wounds, and the occasional demon possession. So clearly, they needed a strong support system, or to get your fever down with some chickpea mash and 5 Hail Marys. Curtains made of linen, if you were lucky, goat hide, if you weren't, sanitation, well, ... The lavatorium was usually a single stone basin shared by 50 people, and a monk named Edgar, who definitely had cholera. These facilities did have some surprisingly modern features, like separate wards for different illnesses, which helped prevent the spread of disease. Sort of like doctors today, medieval monks often had to make house calls, traveling to the homes of the sick and poor. There, they'd perform what we might call palliative care, soothing symptoms with prayers, potions, and unctons, a type of salve. But credit where it's due. Monks knew their herbs. They cultivated gardens filled with sage, rosemary, fennel, mint, foxglove, and the ever-popular wormwood. Wormwood is an evergreen shrub with aromatic leaves that taste like bittersweet tea. Its flowers are tiny and inconspicuous, but its medicinal uses were huge. The plant is naturally high in a chemical that when consumed in small doses can act as a mild anesthetic, making it useful for painful conditions like migraines or toothaches. In fact, wine flavored with wormwood was the go-to remedy for everything from baldness to snake bites, though probably not very effective given their thujan tastes like dirty socks and camphor. Some monasteries had distillation labs, brewing herbal tonics centuries before your aunt started selling essential oils on Instagram. They made bombs, tinctures. Some of it smelled like fermented skunk cabbage and made you see angels. Monasteries were centers of learning, copying and preserving texts that would otherwise be lost to history. Their scribes painstakingly copied and illustrated manuscripts, ensuring the survival of classical medical texts by Roman authors like Galen and Dioscorides, when the Black Death hit, killing up to half of Europe's population. These written records enabled monks and scholars to study the plague and develop potential treatments. In the 14th century, English monk and polymath, John of Burgundy, boiled down recipes from these texts, creating a manual for his fellow friars on how to treat common ailments with herbs and plants. It contained recipes for salves, such as one for a pain-relieving balm made with unicorn, that's a fish spurge or spurge, and red roses. In the 16th century, friar and physician Thomas Garrard included descriptions of over 700 plants in his herbal, based in part on earlier monastic texts. His work was eventually translated into English and published in 1597 under the title The History of Plants. One particularly gruesome recipe from his texts tells us how to treat burns with a plantain leaf. First, boil the plantain root in vinegar, then pluck off the burnt skin until the raw flesh appears. Next, rub the area with the vinegar and cover it in a plantain plaster. For those of you watching at home, a plantain leaf contains a gelatinous substance called allantoin, so it makes sense that they used it to soothe burns. What doesn't make much sense is the step where they pluck off the burnt skin. No wonder this recipe warned readers to first apply the vinegar while reciting the 51st Psalm. Back in our timeline, you haven't been given your prescription pad yet, and you realize it's heavier than you expected. And it smells faintly of cinnamon and something else hard to place. It's a well-worn copy of Hildegard von Bingen's, a medical encyclopedia written around 1150, considered to be the first book on medicine written by a woman. After receiving her visions directly from God, Hildegard went on to become a writer, composer, and spiritual advisor. Her book is full of illustrations of body parts, some of them inaccurate, some of them totally wrong. Take this illustration of the eye, for instance. Hildegard thought there were 4 humors instead of 2, so she drew 3 little devils running around inside your eyeball. She believed these humors could become unbalanced and cause illness. And to diagnose you, she would feel your pulse, look at your urine, and ask about your dreams, because dreams were basically messages from God. So she had a holistic approach. I guess sometimes she advised tremolite, a form of bloodletting where the 4 humors were balanced by removing blood through leeching or cupping. Other times she recommended diets, fasting, and a lot of herbal medicine. Her remedies were pretty straightforward, usually involving boiling herbs and then drinking them. We now know that some of these remedies actually worked. Boil fennel, saffron, long pepper, ginger, rose, bay leaves, aniseed, cardamom, cloves, coriander, white mustard seed, dill, cinnamon, mace, nutmegs, and the juice of prunes. But thanks to the Benedictine monk, Alcuin of York, we have the next entry, which calls for a similar concoction, except with the addition of ground lizard. Alcuin served as a secretary to Charlemagne, the Frankish king who wanted to revive Roman learning, so perhaps he was trying to update Hildegard's recipe to better suit the Frankish palate. Alcuin believed lizards were good for treating ulcers and wounds, as well as relieving pains during childbirth. Lizards can self-amputate their tails when grabbed by predators, and the wound must heal back together really quickly. But no studies have shown that eating a lizard is effective at reducing human pain. And now you have another gift, a vial of oil that the monk has personally collected from the seawater. That is, turns out it is an old wives' tale that monks would roll around in the sea during a storm, collecting the electrified spray on their bodies, and then use it to cure arthritis. But this practice was real. Some believed the salt water could help alleviate pain. Others said it was a miracle. It was probably just electrified. So here's your prescription. Go home, collect seawater during a storm, rub it on your aching bones and pray to Saint Peregrine, the patron saint of bone cancer and miraculous recovery. Hey, it's worth a shot. Now, if you've made it this far, let's finish strong. Let's jump back into the abyss and uncover some of the weirdest remedies, treatments, and cures that medieval doctors swore by. Maybe it's a pesky cold or perhaps the plague. No need to worry. Your friendly neighborhood barber/surgeon has a solution. Bloodletting. It's simple. If the humors are out of whack, you'll feel like hot garbage. Bloodletting could be done via lancets, leeches, or scarification. That's the fancy word for scratching up your skin to drain the bad stuff out. And where do they put the bad stuff? Usually back into the patient after boiling it first. Yes, you heard that right. Boiled blood. Because boiling blood is obviously the most sensible response to an already challenging medical situation. Doctors believed that letting the blood boil would purify it, making it healthier for reintroduction. This practice was based on the belief that the human body was made of 4 humors, which should be kept in balance for optimal health. And to determine whether the humors were in check, they measured the quality of your blood. It didn't matter if it was warm or cold. Blue meant bad. And there was a terrifyingly precise scale for assessing the exact shade of red. They used a plumb line to ensure their blood wasn't too bright. If it was, they sucked some out until it was a healthy hue. But isn't blood supposed to be, pretty much always red? Well, yes, but these folks got very creative with shades. For example, an extremely healthy person had a dark cherry red blood, while someone with high hopes or high heat had a bright red complexion. Sometimes it helped because they were treating real illnesses, not just imaginary ones. But often it weakened patients further. Imagine having a cold and instead of getting some rest and fluids, you have your blood boiled and then reintroduced into your veins. Not exactly what you'd call peak performance. Ever try Tai? It's a Chinese practice that involves a series of slow, flowing movements designed to achieve balance and harmony between mind and body. But did you know that Tai Chi has roots in medicine? See, the theory behind Tai Chi goes a little something like this. The universe is full of Qi, an energy flow that keeps us alive. When we're healthy, our Qi flows smoothly, but illness comes when that flow is blocked. Symptoms show where the blockage is, and curing the illness is all about restoring smooth Qi flow. It sounds kinda woo-woo, but remember, we're talking medieval medicine here, and back then, balancing your Qi was a thing. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine thought that Qi could be balanced by inserting needles into specific points on the body. They also used a technique called coining. Basically, they'd place coins on the skin and hammer them gently. This is not a form of currency exchange. It's a medical procedure. What they were trying to do was push the bad Qi out. And how could they tell where the bad Qi was? Easy. Look for the bumps. These spots were considered acupuncture points where the Qi was out of whack. Practitioners would smack those spots until they turned blue. Those blue spots were a sign that the treatment was working. The bad Qi was leaving the body. Remember those moles we talked about earlier? Yeah. Those were seen as bad Qi bumps too, so rubbing them with herbs or applying leeches was supposed to get rid of the imbalance. And for many people back then, these treatments worked. They relieved pain and other symptoms. Was it a placebo effect? Maybe. But 2 people suffering from various ailments, it didn't matter. They felt better, and that's all that counted. A little chemistry. Most of us think of chemistry as bubbling concoctions in lab coats and safety goggles. But did you know it's actually a lot simpler than that? Like alchemy, a pseudoscience from the Middle Ages. We owe chemistry in part to alchemists, those wacky characters who dabbled in potions and elixirs, searching for gold and maybe a cure for everything else. You see, alchemists experimented with various substances and processes, laying the groundwork for modern chemical principles. They discovered acids and bases, studied the properties of metals and developed laboratory equipment like the crucible. Plus, they were obsessed with elements, specifically those on the periodic table. Nowadays, they're known for wild claims, like turning lead into gold. But hey, some of those claims weren't entirely off base. In the process of trying to transmute lead into gold, they stumbled upon new elements like phosphorus and zinc. Their experiments were messy and dangerous, but they gave us a fundamental understanding of matter. And as for that whole turning lead into gold thing, well, it turns out you can. Technically, alchemy failed as a means of creating gold, but succeeded in giving us chemistry. As for medieval medicine, well, let's just say some of their recipes were more potent than others. The treatment of choice for syphilis. Yes, that metal, used as a topical ointment. And if you're thinking, hey, that sounds like a terrible idea, then you're in agreement with basically every doctor since the 20th century. But during the Middle Ages, it was all the rage. It was even mixed with opium and sprinkled on bread for an extra kick. What were they thinking? Well, partly they were taking advice from none other than the great Galen, the influential Roman physician whose theories dominated medical thinking for centuries. He recommended it for a bunch of conditions, but the main rationale behind its use was to treat syphilis. Back in the 5th-10th century, syphilis was spreading like wildfire, and mercury seemed to slow down its progression. For a while, it was considered a miracle, but the problem was it's not exactly a miracle, it's mercury. A few decades later, physicians realized the side effects of mercury outweighed its benefits: skin irritation, kidney problems, tremors, and in extreme cases, death. So they stopped recommending it. But here's the kicker. Despite the risks, people still wanted a cure for syphilis. And, in the early 1900s, a German chemist found that injecting pure mercury salts could cure the disease. Finally, science won. We had a way to fight syphilis without the side effects of oatmeal baths. But by the mid-20th century, penicillin came along and made that old method obsolete. Still, it's a reminder of how desperate people were to find cures, even if it meant smearing themselves with toxic metals, things that go bump in the night. They say knowledge is power, but sometimes it's plain weird. Take vesico-eruptive, nocturnal, leguminous. It sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but it's actually a medieval diagnosis for bedwetting. To identify this condition, doctors relied on a simple test. After all, they didn't want to mistake bedwetting for something more sinister like nocturnal emissions. And the test was this. The urine had to be free of foam. If there was foam, the patient was suffering from emissions, not the literal kind. The solution to this puzzling ailment: avoid sleep and drink lots of wine. What logic? They believed the wine would dry up the patient's bladder and prevent nighttime accidents. Did it work? Maybe. Or maybe the wine just made them too drunk to notice. Another condition that plagued sleepers was incubus, aka nightmare. The supposed cause: a demon sitting on the chest, making breathing hard and causing vivid dreams. The fix: ask God to remove the incubus or burn the bedding. Yep, that's right. Medieval doctors prescribed arson as a treatment. Luckily, the vast majority of sleeping disorders were blamed on excess phlegm, and for that, they had a trick up their sleeves: mustard plasters. These were usually applied to the chest to help breathe easier and hopefully expel the phlegm. Sometimes they were combined with leech therapy, placing leeches on either side of the chest. They believed it would draw out the excess phlegm, whatever form it may take. And there you have it, a whirlwind tour through medieval medicine, a time when science took some pretty weird turns. But amidst the bloodletting, molting, and demon fighting, glimmers of actual medical progress shone through. It's a reminder that even the strangest practices can serve as stepping stones on the path to scientific discovery. Maybe one day someone will look back at our current medical oddities and marvel at how far we've come. But the kind where you wind up in a different place and time because you were born. After all, when else would you have traveled? There are only two options: before or after. And if you're watching this video, you're in the future. So really, you're stuck with me. The year is 1346. You've just fallen through a wormhole in a museum, or maybe messed around with a cursed pocket watch. Either way, you're in medieval Europe. You're now the proud owner of a fever, a rat bite, and a deep distrust of all liquids that aren't beer. Let's say you wake up with a headache, mild nausea, and some suspicious bumps. In the 21st century, you'd WebM'd it, panic for 3 hours, then decide you're either dehydrated or dying of something very rare. In the 14th century, there's no Google, There is a guy with a sack of dried goose droppings who s 90% sure he prescribes 2 slices of badger fat on rye, a prayer to St. Rochen being buried up to your neck in mud during a full moon. Of course, this is an absurdly bad plan, but let's say you don't know that. How do you survive until you do? For starters, you're gonna need to get past your fellow time travelers' favorite hobby, killing each other. Your first option is diplomacy, which will fail if you're American. So let's go with plan B, stealth. No one pays much attention to what you're wearing unless it's caked in blood or missing a wheel. So grab some cheap fabric, dye it in a big pot of berries, wrap yourself in it, and pray. They assume you're either homeless or a woman. Both are usually fine. Just don't speak unless spoken to. This is easier said than done because the Middle Ages were loud. They had their share of music, theater, jousting, arguing, and catcalls. Most sounds you could drown out by building a wall around yourself, except church bells, because those were everywhere. Worst of all, there's no silence. The general rule is, if you're standing, kneel. If you're kneeling, kneel faster. If you're in a castle, burn it down. Basically, the louder, the better. Also, medieval people liked throwing stuff. Food, rocks, babies, even the occasional cat. The most dangerous thing, though, was wind. When it blew your hair into your face, covering your entire head was safest, but also hottest. So you'd probably want to trade off between full helmets, hoods, and veils. Medieval hygiene is another story. It smells like a goat pen crossed with a sewage plant, so you should probably carry some cloves and mint leaves to spice up your stench. As for diseases, well, you can cut your risk by smelling like death. Plague doctors had the right idea with those bird masks. They just didn't know it was to keep germs in, not the other way around. So, if you smell something worse than a baby in a sewer, run away fast. If you get sick though, you're in trouble. Doctors won't wash their hands, but they will throw up on you, because that's considered purifying. After that, they might lance a boil, set a bone, pull a tooth, or remove an arrow, all without anesthesia. As for home remedies, everyone swears by one, but no one knows what causes illness, so you can't prove that your treatment works. That means every cure is just a placebo effect and a coin toss. At least your visit won't end with a trip to the gallows. Unlike modern times, you couldn't sue a doctor for malpractice, but you could sue him for practicing magic. That's why many treatments involve a lot of prayers, animal parts, and demon banishing, which makes sense. If you're bleeding profusely, a prayer won't help, but it might make you feel better. Animal parts can stop bleeding if by some miracle you find the right combination, while also making you look like you're sacrificing a small animal to a deity. And banishing demons never hurts, though it'll annoy the local priest. If anyone asks what you're doing, just say you're protecting yourself against sorcery, because everyone knows that's real. A little preparation goes a long way. If you know you're traveling to the Middle Ages, pack a small bag with these items. It'll improve your chances of survival, though it won't protect you from dying horribly. To qualify, the item needs to be useful in the Middle Ages, easy to transport, and not easily replaced. With that in mind, here's what you should pack. Soap. Literal magic in the Middle Ages. The key is bringing something stronger than medieval soap, which was often just ash and water. Bring something like Dr. Then use the bar to wash your hands, your clothes, and anything else that hasn't turned into a corpse yet. It's also solid, so you don't have to worry about spilling it. And it comes in small sizes. Bonus points if it's scented because perfume wasn't invented yet. But cleaning yourself does have its limits. Boiled water. Medieval water was unsafe to drink, but boiling it made it safe. Easy, right? Well, you have to get water first, then bring it to a rolling boil, which requires a stove and fuel. Finally, you need to keep it hot until you drink it. For that, you need a thermos or insulated bottle. Otherwise, you'll spend half your time reheating water. But you can't carry a stove and fuel and a thermos with you. It's heavy. Why not carry something more useful, like honey? Not only is it delicious, but it's also great for wounds. Plus, it doubles as currency if things get weird. Salt. Back then, people used salt to preserve food and disinfect cuts, and it's still recommended today for pickling and preserving fruit. Oh, and it keeps demons out of your shoes. You'll want to find a way to carry Medieval cooking was basically sweet or pillable, so flavorings like cinnamon and cloves will make you popular, but you can't carry a whole spice rack. So pick the ones you like best and bring a lot of pepper. Black pepper, that is, white pepper was for poor people. And finally, charisma. Because if you're not charming, they'll assume you're possessed. Now, you could carry a gun and a Bible and save everyone, but then they'll figure out that time travel is real. So let's keep this between us, shall we? But you may not need any of that gear if you're traveling to the distant future. In this series, I explore what we can learn from the weirdest jobs, skills, and hobbies around the world. Let's be honest, you've spent the last 20 minutes either laughing, cringing, or mentally swearing never to complain about your HMO again. But here's the twist in the wound. They weren't stupid. No refrigeration, no sterile bandages, no concept of vitamins, blood types, or bacteria. The human body was a terrifying black box that leaked, swelled, coughed, and died for reasons no one could explain. And yet, they still tried. They mixed herbs, mapped the stars, scribbled theories in candlelight, and yes, rubbed moles on foreheads and cooked beetles into tea. But because they were terrified of doing nothing. Tell me this, Dosanti, ring a bell. I read somewhere this mushroom boosts immunity. My cousin swears by garlic oil. I don't trust doctors. I just eat clean and burn sage. We're not immune to magical thinking. Essential oils instead of boiled weasel. Juice cleanses instead of fasting for penance. Wellness influencers instead of wandering monks. We still crave control over our bodies. We still reach for comfort instead of science because comfort feels like healing. So, no, medieval medicine wasn't just blood and bad guts. And proof that, even in the darkest centuries, people still cared enough to try. Every leech, every charm, every monk scribbling a remedy onto a goatskin scroll that was a tiny act of resistance against death. A vote of confidence in the future. And you are living in the result of that stubborn hope. So first off, let us set aside any cringe-inducing memories of leeches and tremolite and the rest of the truly horrific stuff that got lumped together under the vague heading of medieval medicine. Because while it is true that many of the treatments of yesteryear might make your eyes roll so hard they get stuck in the back of your head, sure, there were tons of misconceptions but given how little they actually knew about how the human body works, the fact that anyone survived long enough to pass on their wacky medical theories is kind of miraculous in itself. I mean, I've been to the doctor recently for something as simple as a rash and walked away with a prescription for medication that interacts dangerously with my other prescriptions. And I live in a world where Google searches can turn up a potential diagnosis in seconds, and telemedicine appointments can connect you with a professional in minutes. What I'm trying to say is, if you find yourself wincing at some of the more outlandish practices attributed to medieval medicine, take heart. You are far from the first to ever roll your eyes at somebody else's beliefs about health. Now, before we dive into the surprisingly surprising ways people coped with sickness and injury without modern medicine, let's take a moment to answer the obvious. Why do we call the period from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD? Turns out it was UNA actually called that until the 1800s. When historians realized there was a gap in their understanding of European history between the glory that is ancient Rome and the glory that is the Renaissance. See, the name comes from French historian Lucien Faber, who said, quote, "We have to study the Middle Ages, not merely as a transitional period which separates classical antiquity from modern times, but as an entirely distinct formation which possesses its own specific features." Basically, they named it the Middle Ages not because they thought it was in the middle of time, but because it was in the middle of their research. So, sorry, historians, but I'm still going to go ahead and call it the Middle Ages. The problem is there is no single straightforward answer to why this particular stretch of time was such a massive swing in mortality rates, which is a big reason why the population dropped so dramatically in Europe, but it didn't affect Asia and Africa nearly as much. Others point to increased warfare, poverty, and famine. But again, those things also happened outside of the so-called Middle Ages. The reality is, scholars are still trying to figure out why this era saw such drastic dips in life expectancy, and we don't know if it's because they were rubbing moles on foreheads. But what we do know is that during this time, huge swaths of people believed the world had turned upside down, that the sun was swallowed by the moon and the sky fell to earth. And for centuries, they used that anxiety to develop increasingly inventive ways to fix it. Take, for example, the Great Conjunction of 1603, when Jupiter and Saturn appeared unnaturally close together in the night sky. So close, in fact, that they seemed to collide. This rare celestial event spooked churchgoers who believed the end of days was upon them. And then there was the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-1300s and killed around 30 to 50% of the population. People were so convinced God was angry at humanity that they started throwing themselves at the mercy of saints, hoping a miracle would save them. Thousands of people died falling off cliffs and out of windows after leaping to their deaths to escape death. Talk about counterintuitive. Faced with these kinds of crises, you kind of have to do whatever you think might work. Now, sure, today we mock people who swear by a daily dose of unicorn tears to prevent COVID, but they too are faced with a world turned upside down, a global pandemic that has killed millions and counting. All we have to do is remember that the internet wasn't around in the Middle Ages, so if you wanted to trade knowledge with your neighbors about what worked and what didn't, you needed to physically leave your home. For hundreds of years, the most common form of medical advice came from traveling peddlers. Traveling monks were another major source of health wisdom, though. To be fair, they probably meant well. Many kept detailed journals of their experiences treating illness, which are still being studied by historians today. Take, for example, the case of Saint Hildegard von Bingen, an extremely devout German Benedictine abbess, whose writings on herbal medicine were widely circulated across Europe in the late 1090s. Hildegard prescribed a treatment of dried lizard mixed with wine to cure everything from headache to epilepsy. But not every medieval doctor was quite so misguided. One of the most prominent physicians of the era was Ibn Sina, a Persian scholar whose 5-book encyclopedia of medicine, known as the Canon of Medicine, was a standard textbook in medical schools for centuries. His work emphasized observation and reason, urging doctors to diagnose patients based on their symptoms rather than guesswork. Although his ideas were largely based on Greek and Roman texts, he added to the conversation with practical recommendations about things like smallpox inoculation, which we now know is effective at fighting the disease. He also promoted public sanitation measures like quarantining sick individuals to stop the spread of disease. But despite his insights, medieval physicians didn't always see eye to eye with scientists. For centuries, the Church saw science and religion as completely separate spheres. Religious leaders argued that since God was in control of the world, humans couldn't possibly understand how nature worked, and the only people who claimed otherwise were heretics. As a result, science and technology took a back seat for much of the Middle Ages. Scholars who dared to question the prevailing theories of the universe were often persecuted, which led to an exodus of intellectuals from Europe to places like Baghdad, where the House of Wisdom became a beacon for astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers. It was during this golden age of Islam that figures like Al-Khwarizmi made groundbreaking discoveries in algebra, astronomy, and geography. But eventually, scientific inquiry in the West started to creep back into Europe. A Franciscan friar, who urged fellow scholars to embrace observation and experimentation rather than relying on the work of past authorities. And though he was investigated by the Inquisition for his views on optics and astronomy, he laid the groundwork for empirical science. But perhaps nowhere was the struggle to reconcile science and religion more evident than in the heated debates surrounding him. After Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus published his theory that the Earth revolved around the Sun, his ideas were met with fierce opposition from church officials. It was until the work of Galileo Galilei and Isaac Newton that heliocentrism finally started to gain widespread acceptance. Scientists still struggled to make sense of everything from the origin of species to the structure of atoms. In 15th century France, a woman named Trizette went to see a doctor for some mysterious symptoms. Fever, pain, shivering. She'd seen a traveling healer named Isobo for an unspecified illness 3 years prior, and the medicine Trizette was taking wasn't working, so she decided to consult a different doctor. Dr. Pierbon, who took one look at her and said, "You've got a classic case of melancholy." Yep, melancholic. In case you haven't heard, melancholy is a sickness. Back then, it meant depression, but it also covered things like headaches and digestive problems. Since doctors thought everything came from the 4 humors, balance of fluids in the body, Dr. Bon prescribed Trizette to eat more pork, drink wine, and to help her relax. He gave her a bottle of aqua tofana, a herbal remedy so strong it would make you sleep forever. Well, maybe not literally forever. That's not how forever works. But it did make Trizette go to sleep permanently. Her family sued Dr. Bourne. He was tried for murder and sent to prison, but later acquitted on the grounds that, well, no one really knew what they were doing. Doctors had been prescribing toxic mercury, poisonous plants, and even small pebbles that tasted like dirt because they thought they were curing a range of illnesses. It was the Middle Ages, after all, when doctors were often clueless, corrupt, and occasionally murderous. There was no scientific basis for any of it. It was all guesswork and good intentions, kind of like the infomercials we watch today. Close your eyes. You're walking through a bustling medieval town square. The air smells like a chaotic mix of baked bread, wet hay, horse poop, and faintly rotting fish. And then you hear the voice. Step right up. Cure all ills. Warts, boils, heartbreak, and demonic possession. Welcome to the medical marketplace, where hope is for sale, and the return policy is non-existent. There's a man in a wide-brimmed hat juggling small jars of glowing liquid. He swears it's the elixir of life, made with rare ingredients. Powdered unicorn horn, sun-dried salamander, and a whisper from a virgin breeze. Translation: chalk, river water, and probably your next stomachache. Beside him, a guy with a live goose on a leash. He claims its breath can cure tuberculosis. People line up. The goose looks deeply unamused. Around the corner, another healer is doing street surgery. Yes, live demo. Right there on a wooden cart. Tooth pulling is a crowd favorite. The patient is screaming. The audience is cheering like it's a juggling act. And when the tooth finally pops out, the healer holds it up like a trophy and the crowd applauds as if someone just won Medieval Got Talent. Then he offers the tooth back as a good luck charm for an extra penny. Maybe don't do that. But our intrepid shopper isn't deterred. Over there, a woman is bottling fresh urine, claiming it's a cure-all. Great. How many bottles for an overnight shipping? Another merchant is giving out free samples of his new product, leech oil. Sure, leeches are gross, but they suck blood out of your pores and replace it with fresh, oxygenated blood. A bargain at 2 shillings a pint. Plus, he's giving out free tips on how to properly cut open your veins. For such a fair price, how could our hero say no? Traveling healers would roll into town, set up shop for a day or two and vanish before anyone could ask why their miracle potion caused explosive regret. To their credit, these docs weren't always trying to scam people. Sometimes they truly believed they were helping. After all, most of them spent years training. They just didn't know that the secret to great medicine lay outside their grimoires and inside a lab. Traveling healers, peddlers of fake cures, quack medicine men, and evil dentists with dreams of being gladiators. All of these shady characters populated medieval streets. They sold plague charms made from toad hearts, love potions, mostly 99% alcohol with 1% crushed rose petals, miracle salves guaranteed to fix anything, unless you died, in which case you clearly didn't use enough. And to attract customers, they put on quite the show. Ever wanted to watch someone get lanced, boiled, or pulled apart by a horse? Now was your chance. Not exactly the Disney World of entertainment, but hey, it was free, or at least it was until you got the urge to buy something you didn't need. And don't forget the raffles. Every purchase entered you to win a pet monkey or a lifetime supply of syphilis. Now sometimes these traveling docs really did have a cure too. We know that because, when they disappeared, people would blame the local priests and demand to know why he hadn't stopped these quacks. And even though the church had nothing to do with it, the priests answered the call, railing against the evils of buying medicine from people who couldn't read. But those quacks weren't stupid. They knew the dangers of looking too good to be true. And while they happily showed up to town squares and fairs, you couldn't find them once the bishop rolled into town with his holy water, and that wasn't a coincidence. Most of these quacks didn't have any formal medical training and avoided the official medical establishment, but that didn't mean there wasn't some overlap. A few doctors and surgeons had side hustles hawking fake cures. That's how the legends of doctors who could turn lead into gold and transform human skin into bronze started. One of the most famous was Bernardino Ramazzini, the Italian doctor known as the father of occupational medicine. When he wasn't publishing treatises about workplace safety, he was running around northern Italy selling a plaster that was supposed to turn lead into gold, but mostly turned people into poor. When Triosette died after taking her prescription from Dr. Bon, she became the poster child for bad medical advice. Her case helped establish the first medical board in Paris, but it was unlong before figured out how to recreate Dr. Bonner's handwriting and dupe the board. Even today, we can't seem to escape bad medical advice. No matter how much progress we make, there's still a lot of fake news. These days our medical marketplaces are online ads for superfood powders, unproven supplements and TikTok trends, like raw garlic in your nose cures colds. At least now you can leave a 1-star review instead of a sack of eggs. And while no one's selling mercury as a treatment for smallpox anymore, bad ideas never really go away. In fact, they come back in fashion. So next time you need medical advice, be careful where you go. You wouldn't want to end up in an operating room in the middle of a medieval marketplace, would you? Have you ever wondered how the Middle Ages got so, well, medieval? To answer that question, we've traveled back in time to bring you the best and worst of the Dark Ages. Here you'll find all the death, disease and destruction that defined the era known as the Black Death. That and the occasional inspirational story of monks brewing their way through self-flagellation and into groundbreaking science. Today, we're re-exploring what was arguably the most explosive period of scientific inquiry the world had yet seen: alchemy. Picture this. A small stone workshop, torchlight flickering, off shelves lined with mysterious jars. Liquids shimmer green and gold. Dried plants dangle upside down like tiny witches' brooms. Somewhere, something is bubbling ominously. And in the middle of it all, a medieval experimenter, part healer, part alchemist, part enthusiastic. Alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold, though. Yes, that was the dream. It was also about finding the elixir of life and discovering new remedies. And the experiments. Yeah, about that. Dangerous. Heat that potion too much. Kaboom. Mix the wrong herbs. You see God early. Inhale the fumes. Your neighbors assume you've been possessed. So if that's not enough to make you want to stay far, far away, here's an invitation to join the party. The first rule of Alchemy Club: don't talk about Alchemy Club. Your local bishop probably views the whole thing as a heretical waste of time, possibly related to witchcraft. That's because alchemy combined religious piety, mystical mumbo-jumbo, astrology, and, making things explode. As a result, alchemists were often viewed suspiciously by both scientists and the clergy. Still wanting. Okay, then let's get started. Your first assignment: learn Latin. No, you don't need to get all the way up to priest level. You just need to understand some scientific and pseudoscientific texts. After that, you can get to work creating detailed diagrams of the stuff you're putting in your potions, because observation is everything. Also, you need to practice your handwriting, because writing is your only record of what worked, what almost worked, and what turned your assistant into a pile of ash. Next up, start collecting ingredients. You'll need animal parts, precious metals, minerals, and lots of plant matter. The more obscure the better, because alchemy was both a pseudoscience and a kind of magic. Its practitioners believed that exotic locations produced special ingredients, so sending someone on a quest to retrieve unicorn horn or dragon's teeth was totally legit. It was also legit to sell fake dragon teeth, which is how those ended up in so many European museums. Finally, get ready to follow recipes. Hundreds of pages of handwritten instructions detailing every step of the process are essential to avoid disaster. Oh, and you should probably isolate yourself from human society. Now that you're safely ensconced in your mad scientist cave, it's time to get down to business. First up on the agenda, purifying base metals like lead into pure gold. Yep, that's right. Alchemists dreamed of transmutation, turning one metal into another. They may have failed at that particular goal, but they did develop modern processes like distillation and crystallization along the way. Distillation, which involved heating mixtures until they became vapors and then cooling them back into liquids, turned out to have medical uses as well. By distilling alcohol, they created powerful medicines, especially for wound care. Medicines like brandy, whiskey, and gin. Pretty much any liquor you can drink is a direct descendant of alchemy. Alchemists also made important discoveries about chemistry. One of the most famous, Isaac Newton, devoted a huge portion of his life to alchemy, searching for the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that could turn lead into gold and cure any ailment. He kept detailed notes, including illustrations of his experiments, which showed that he understood substances changed when mixed, a precursor to the modern understanding of chemical reactions. His ideas were so influential that alchemists built on them for years. But alchemy wasn't just about gold. It was also about longevity. Many alchemists believed that studying metals would lead them to the secret of eternal life. Again, they never found it, but they did pioneer ways of preserving human remains, even accidentally. You see, many alchemists were also it was convenient to study the body after death, but sometimes the preservation methods, shall we say, overdid it. For instance, in 1828, a British professor of chemistry cut open a preserved head to show its construction. Much to everyone's surprise, it bit him. But finally, there was the most immediately useful application of alchemy: medicine. Across Europe, Asia, and Africa, alchemists experimented with recipes to cure illnesses and ease pain. They isolated chemicals from plants and minerals, creating treatments that were purer and more effective than anything available before. The trouble was testing a new cure in the Middle Ages usually meant trying it on yourself or your most gullible neighbor. Well, congratulations, you're now part of a cautionary tale in someone's notebook. A medieval pharmacist named John of Burgundy recorded the results of his experiments in the margin of his recipe book. Under a recipe for a treatment for ulcers, he wrote, "I myself used this ointment on my own leg, and found it good." Under a treatment for a cold in the head, he noted, "Nicholas, the son of Richard the Potter, tried this against a cold and lost his voice." These careful records helped future experimenters build on previous work, which is how alchemy nudged medicine forward, sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 big explosion backwards. It was an important ingredient in many treatments and cures, applied directly to wounds to stop bleeding and inside the body to treat syphilis. The problem was that mercury is highly poisonous, and inhaling its fumes will kill you faster than a medieval guillotine. Alchemists didn't understand that, though. They kept experimenting and inadvertently killing themselves. Other times, progress was a little slower. Take opium, which people have used for pain relief since ancient times. But it took centuries for alchemists to isolate morphine from it. Then, once they did, they were afraid to use it because opium had religious connotations.
That's right.
It was habit-forming, so they held off on prescribing it until they could figure out its addictive properties. If you think that sounds crazy, wait till we tell you about Roger Bacon. This English monk was a true Renaissance man, a Franciscan friar, scientist, and pioneer of modern experimental science. Not that you'd know it from his writings. Since the Catholic Church frowned on scientific pursuits, Bacon wrote about alchemy under a pseudonym and hid his work in philosophical stories. One of his books, Opus Majus, contained instructions on how to create gunpowder, which he claimed to have received from a Wizara. The church promptly banned the book and put Bacon in jail. No word on whether he brought any explosives with him. Alchemy was full of contradictions like that. Experimentation and religion, explosions and safety, and progress and disaster. Despite its shortcomings, alchemy advanced because its practitioners kept trying. Over and over, regardless of the danger, they tested, recorded, repeated, and refined. Sometimes that meant trying again and again until a recipe worked. Other times it meant repeating mistakes, like mixing corrosive sublimate, which could burn a hole through a leaden chamber pot. But each attempt moved science a little further. And what happens when you mix mercuric sulfide and sulfuric acid? Boom. Now you know. When you think of the Middle Ages, what do you picture? Chivalrous knights, damsels in distress, gruesome plague victims. Maybe you imagine the Black Death sweeping through Europe, killing millions. Hey, there's nothing like a pandemic to put your era in the spotlight. So grab your monocle and prepare to travel back in time. But you've blocked that memory from your mind, because you were sentenced to that activity by an evil Roman emperor. Well, thanks to our friend Nicolaus Copernicus, it's easier than ever to do that now. He's made the Earth go away so it won't interfere with your work. Can you hold a pig's heart in your hand and not think about how disgusting it is? But that was the point of public dissections in the early Renaissance. It's the late 1400s and you're a student at the University of Padua, so you grab your stool and join the crowd in front of the lecture hall, where you settle in for what will be a truly special day of learning. Because today Professor Taddeo Alderotti is reading from the classic text on the nature of things, by the Greco-Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder, and the university has actually gotten a real live body to use as a prop. The professor stands up on a raised podium and dramatically reads aloud from his book. The liver floats upon the lungs and under the stomach. Everyone stares intently while he motions with a finger towards the corpse laid out on the table. Then a doctor walks over and starts cutting the body open. We'll tell you what he finds in just a second. This was basically the formula for every public dissection during the early Renaissance. The star of the show was always some recently deceased person who was donated to the university for the cause. Usually, they were people who died of the plague, so nobody was super attached to their body. These dissections were technically run by the surgeons, an occupational class that was usually looked down on by physicians, who preferred working with living patients, because, cutting someone open and taking a look around was a little risky. You got to do all the gross stuff, while the physician stayed up on his high horse and said, ooh, but also, very interesting. Dissections weren't just academic events, they were also entertainment. Students, professors, and sometimes even priests would gather around, dissect a body, and hope for something cool to happen. Doctors had no idea how the human body worked back then. The standard teaching based on the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans was that the liver was the seat of the soul, and it floated on your lungs. When the professor shouted, "Behold, we have found the truth," sometimes there were even famous guests in attendance, like this 15th century painting shows. Two men on horseback ride through a city gate. They're greeted by a crowd of townspeople. Wait, why are they waving and holding up a severed head like a trophy? Because these guys are returning from a trip to the beach where they found a drowned woman, chopped her head off and gave it to the local medical school for a public dissection. If I came across a dead body, my reaction would be, let's find out if this whole floating liver thing checks out. To be fair, the guy holding the liver didn't expect the applause. In fact, not only did these crowds of spectators enjoy the dissections, people would pay admission tickets with the fee going to the poor family who donated the body. After one dissection, the skull of the cadaver was put on display in a church and people started making pilgrimages to see it. One young man wrote home about how he'd been to the public dissection. From this, I learned a great deal and profited much. But honestly, don't worry, it gets weirder. Most people couldn't afford to attend a public dissection, so they took their entertainment home. You could buy anatomical drawings and then hang them up on your wall like a fancy poster. A popular souvenir was a pair of gloves made from human skin. Some people collected skulls and then painted and displayed them like fine art. Others would pick up a single bone and polish it until it gleamed, and then they'd proudly mount it on their mantelpiece. Anatomy even became a fashion accessory. Artists like Michelangelo used the spare ribs to decorate their clothing. Basically, if you were in Florence in the late 1400s and you wanted to prove that you were cultured, having an anatomical drawing or an anatomical hat was the way to do it. It was like saying, yeah, I'm well read. I know what's inside a human body. Unlike you, there was some real learning happening here. People were excited to have their eyes open to the possibilities of the human body and eager to understand how it worked. It was as though for the first time in centuries, people were allowed to wonder about the body and answer their own questions without being persecuted for it. Of course, everyone's favorite thing to dissect was the heart, because it was believed to be the organ of emotions. Remember when they cut open that old guy and saw that the liver didn't float on the lungs? Well, a few years later, a student correctly identified the arteries leading to the heart. Next, they found the veins and realized that the blood was circulating throughout the entire body and pumping oxygen and nutrients to vital organs. With that breakthrough, scientists were able to start understanding things like blood pressure and the effects of exercise on the body. And soon they were performing literally keeping animals alive and cutting them open to watch their circulatory systems pump along. It was horrible, sure, but at least they were finally starting to learn about how the human body works. The best part of this newfound knowledge is that it was available for anyone who could read. No longer did you need to spend 5 years writing anatomical texts by hand and making beautiful illustrations, like the ones in these books. The printing press arrived in Italy in 1440, invented by Johannes Gutenberg, and it completely changed the landscape of education. Suddenly, copies of the most important texts could be printed quickly and distributed to anyone interested in reading them. Soon, Andreas Vesalius published the definitive anatomical textbook of the age, Geomoni Corporis Fabrica, which contained 191 detailed plates of the human body. Vesalius dissected every organ and muscle and bone, and meticulously recorded his findings. Not only was Vesalius uncovering brand new knowledge about the human body, but he was also calling out mistakes in ancient texts, which had been accepted as fact for hundreds of years. He was also correcting anatomical drawings that had become so inaccurate over time that they'd taken on a life of their own. What started as a simple illustration of a human ribcage ended up looking nothing like a ribcage and everything like a pair of pants. Vesalius was so thorough that he completely revamped the study of anatomy and showed the world that there was so much more to learn. His textbook remained the standard for generations of medical students. In 1543, a Polish scientist published a new theory about the solar system. Nicolaus Copernicus developed heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun. He basically made the Earth go away, so it wouldn't get in the way of the truth. And this was huge. For one thing, it revealed just how small the Earth is, in comparison to the rest of the universe. But more importantly, it taught people that the Earth isn't the center of everything. It's just a planet in orbit like every other planet. This inspired scientists to look at everything around them in a different way, including themselves. They started to ask questions about how the body works, and began experimenting with ways to improve human health. Public dissections became more common, and universities created chairs of anatomy, meaning that doctors could focus on studying the body and its functions rather than relying on ancient texts that had been proven wrong by modern science. These professors and surgeons were still working with dead bodies. No matter how much they learned, They couldn't test their theories or see the body in action. But the work they did paved the way for future discoveries. In the next century, doctors began using live animals to test their theories, which led to the discovery of circulation in the brain. Then came vaccines, sepsis, and the miracle of modern surgery, plus anesthesia, because no one likes to feel pain. All of this came about because a group of Italian artists, scientists, and doctors got together and said, you know what? We think we know what is inside the human body, and we pretty sure it is not what everyone has been telling us it is. And if they hadn't dared to investigate, none of us would have ever known. Thank you so much for watching. I'm from the channel